Hi, I'm Jay Leeming, and thank you for listening to this podcast. If you are able to support this podcast by joining my Patreon community, please do so. That gives you access to bonus recordings, as well as to performances I do online of many of the great epics of the world. And it also ensures that I can make these recordings freely available to others. You can join that community at patreon.com/storyjl. Thanks very much. Hello, and welcome to the Crane Bag Podcast. I am Jay Leeming. We are exploring the great epic known as the Iliad, exploring it in all its breadth, in all its shadows, and its bright sunlit days. What has happened so far? Well, a lot has happened. There was a wedding between a human king named Peleus and a goddess named Thetis, the goddess of the deep waters. And that wedding was a harmonious occasion, and all of creation seemed to be unified and joined together in laughter and in harmony. But that gathering gave birth, as it were, to trouble, which was the judgment of Paris, in which a humble shepherd named Paris had to choose between three goddesses, Aphrodite, Hera, and Athena, because he was holding in his hand a golden apple, which was to be given to the most beautiful of them all. Well, this caused some trouble. And we heard something about that trouble, and we learned of Paris's background and how, in fact, he was a prince of Troy, and he went to Troy and was recognized and celebrated there for being the son of none other than Priam the king and Hecuba the queen. That is more or less the story, minus a sea dragon or two, minus a god chained to a rock or two. But today, our business is to continue with this story, to enter the flowing river of this epic filled with images, to enter this dream and see what it has to tell us. Thank you for joining me. Let us begin. Well, one day, in the seaside kingdom of Phthia, a child was born to King Peleus and to Thetis, the goddess of the deep waters. And there was much rejoicing in the kingdom at this birth of a son. And there was rejoicing in the world of the gods as well. For news of this spread, and soon Zeus, Aphrodite, Hera, everyone knew that a child had been born who was part god and part human. And so the human and the divine worlds were woven together, knit together by this event, in the body, in the person, in the life of this boy. And they named this boy Achilles. And so these were joyous days, these were joyous weeks for everyone. And then one night, Thetis had a dream. And she dreamed of a ship on a beach that was filled with fire. The flames crackling along the deck and up the mast. And she dreamed of 1,000 men, brandishing sharp spears, running across a field. And she dreamed of a river with anger in its heart, a river threatening to drown all of humanity. So she dreamed. So she dreamed of fire, of death and destruction. And then she awoke. It was dark. Everyone was asleep, even the birds. And her heart said, "Danger." But the palace was quiet. And her heart said, "Danger," as she got up from the bed. And her heart said, "Danger," as she walked to the crib where her infant son Achilles lay. And then she picked him up, held him in her arms, and she began to walk. And she walked through the dark hallways of that palace and out into the forest. And she walked through that forest and down into a gully where there was a trickling stream. And beside that stream there was a cavern. And so, holding her baby boy Achilles in her arms, the goddess Thetis entered that cavern, entered that darkness, and began to walk down. Down and down she went, into the throat of the night, the trail descending like a thread in the great tapestry of creation. And after a while there was no path beneath her feet. After a while there was only thick darkness, and she, a goddess, went drifting down through that darkness, deeper and deeper. And after a while, a great shivering squall of despair and sadness came, writhing and gasping, rippling around them. And then, like a cloud, they passed through it, and all was silence once more. And after a while, there was a path beneath her feet once more, and she walked on this path. And then she heard a great rushing, whispering sound, and she came to the edge, to the bank of the great river Styx, the oldest of all the rivers in this world. A river that had defended Zeus against the Titans and the giants in the battle back at the beginning of time. The river by whom all the gods swear their oaths. And she lifted Achilles up, and holding him by one ankle, she dunked him down into those waters. He came up crying, and she wrapped him in a blanket, and she began to walk. And they left that murmuring, whispering stream behind them, the great, dark, smoking weight of it sliding away into the shadows. And she walked up a rocky trail. And once again, she came to a place where there was no trail at all, where there was only thick darkness. And once again, she walked through this squall of sadness and despair, all the cries of those recently deceased, rising up from the bottom of the world. And then the cries whimpered and died away. And she found a trail beneath her feet once more. Up and up she climbed, out of the underworld. And she came to that cavern once more, and she stepped out beside that trickling stream. And carrying Achilles, sleeping in her arms, she walked through that forest. And then she came from that forest back into the palace. And she walked to the feasting hall of that palace. And there in the center were the embers of a fire glowing. And she bent down and she blew on those embers, and the fire went crackling up like a bright question in the night. And then she took her son Achilles, and she bent down and she placed him on that fire. But he did not cry out. He continued to sleep quietly, peacefully. And then Thetis began to sing. Hey, do not fear. Hey, little one, hey, little one, do not fear, do not fear. And she spoke beautiful words under her breath, words of moonlight and the edges of stars. And she said, may the waters of the river Styx, those waters of death, and may this fire, which is brightness and light and a sharp question, may these things destroy each other. May you, my son, be invincible. May you be like a god. May you live forever. These words were moonlight and black water. They were threads of laughter shining in the great tapestry of what is, and still she sang, hey, little one, hey, little one, do not fear, do not fear, do not fear. But in that palace, there was someone awake, and it was King Peleus. Perhaps he had heard a footstep. Perhaps it was a gust of wind. But he awoke in the darkness, and he saw that Thetis was not beside him. And he saw that Achilles, his son, was not in the crib there by the window. So, alarmed, he stood up, and he walked out of their bedroom and through the hallways of the palace. And far away, he could hear sounds. Someone was singing. He walked down the hallway. There was the door. There was light pulsing at the edges of this door. There was a fire glowing in that room, and he heard that singing, and he walked, and he walked, and he pushed that door open, and he saw his child Achilles there on the fire. "What are you doing?" he said. "What are you doing, crazy woman?" And she turned and she glared at him. And Thetis lifted Achilles out of the fire and placed him on the cold stones. And she said, "Peleus, my king, my love, now I must leave you. Once you held me in a cave, but I am not to be held. I am not to be boxed in by your strange human questions. Our son Achilles could have been invincible, could have been immortal, but now he shall live a mortal life. He shall know sorrow and sickness and death. But though he will die as all you mortals die, still in this life he will come to know love. For a dark-haired one will come to him, and they will share a love between them, deep and beautiful like the sea. And this one's name shall be Patroclus. Goodbye, my king. Goodbye, my love." And with that she turned into a swarm of bees and went swirling up towards the heights of that room. "No," said Peleus, "no." He rushed forward. He scooped Achilles up into his arms, his crying child, comforting him as the bees swarmed above him in the air, and then they went funneling out a window into the night. And King Peleus rushed out of that room, rushed out of the palace and into the forest, holding Achilles in his arms, and he looked up, and he saw no bees, but only a single osprey perched on a branch. "Thetis," he said, "Thetis, my love, don't go." The osprey looked at him, cocked its head to the side, and then flapped away into the dark. And that night King Peleus comforted his son Achilles. Though Thetis was not there, he held him close to him, and Achilles slept warm and safe beside him. And so King Peleus raised Achilles there, in the kingdom of Phthia beside the sea, in that palace and in the forests around. He raised him on his own, though he did have help. For one day he brought him high up to the heights of that kingdom. And he, with his son Achilles in his arms, walked across that meadow where once there had been a wedding, where once the muses had sang, where once he and Thetis had sat in beautiful chairs and received the gifts of the gods, where once a golden apple had come and landed in the grass. And he walked across that meadow and came to a cave. And he called out into that darkness, and Chiron the centaur came, the grandfather of King Peleus. And so Chiron began to teach Achilles. And almost every day Achilles could be seen, as he grew older, riding on the back of Chiron the centaur. And they would gallop through that forest, and Chiron taught him about the plants that heal and the plants that cause harm, taught him the names of the stars and the habits of all the animals, and the names of the trees and the stories that go with every leaf and seed and bird and cloud in this world. And so Achilles grew older, and learned many things from Chiron, and learned many things from King Peleus in that kingdom beside the sea. And then on a day like any other, Chiron the centaur galloped down from the heights of that kingdom down to the palace, and Achilles was on his back, about 12 years old by this time. And Achilles got off of Chiron and said goodbye to his teacher and walked into the palace. But on this day something was different. For when he came to the great feasting hall, there beside the fire was another boy, a boy a little older than Achilles, a boy with long dark hair, and he was playing with some green dice. "Where did you get those?" said Achilles. "My father gave them to me," the boy said. "He sent me here. It seems I'm going to be staying with you for a while." "What's your name?" "I'm Patroclus. And you?" "I'm Achilles." "Do you want to play dice?" Patroclus said. "Yes," said Achilles. So the two of them sat down together by the fire, and they began to play dice. Well, years passed, and then one night Zeus brought rain to the world, rain which fell on the roof of the palace of King Peleus, inside of which Patroclus and Achilles slept, rain which fell onto the forest, where once Thetis had walked, rain which fell on the sea, and rain which fell far out in the middle of that sea, where, in the height of that storm, there was a boat. And on this boat was a man from Troy, wearing a green cloak decorated with the image of a mother bear, and his name was Paris. And beside him was his friend Aeneas, and all the sailors around them, and all together they were working to keep that boat afloat in the storm, lashing everything down as the wind blew, gusts of shrieking winds coming across the sea, the waves being driven higher and higher. And so for much of the night, drenched to the bone, they were pitched this way and that over the sea. And then finally, in the middle of that darkness, the wind died down, and the sea became calm, and even the clouds overhead scattered and drifted away, and they could see the moon shining down, and not too far off they saw a shore. "We set out for Crete," said Paris, "but the gods have brought us to another place." "Yes," said Aeneas, "and whether kind or cruel, we will soon find out." So they took their oars in their hands, and they dug them deep into the waves, and wearily they paddled to that shore and brought their boat up onto the sand. Now there was a stone watchtower there, not far off, and a guard was there watching, and he came down the spiraling stairs and walked across the sand. "Dear sailors," he said, "you've had the worst of it out in that storm all night long. Well, you have come to the kingdom of Sparta, and you are most welcome here. Come, let's get you to the palace and to a warm fire." And so, gratefully, they followed this watchman away from the beach, up past the stone tower and through a small forest, until they came to a palace. And there at the gate was an old woman holding a torch, and the guards spoke to her and said, "Sailors have come to us, washed ashore. They're wet to the bone. Is there a fire in the feasting hall?" "Yes, there is," said the old woman, "but the queen and her sister are there. Perhaps take them to the yellow room." So the guard led them through the palace, through the hallways, and he brought them to a room painted yellow, and there in the hearth was a blazing fire. And they stood around that fire, and they wrung out their clothes and draped them over chairs or there by the fire, and they warmed themselves by those flames. And a servant came and brought them bread and wine and some dates and some cheese. And gratefully they enjoyed these things, the gifts of the earth. Gratefully they enjoyed the warmth of that fire. But they were tired sailors. So one by one they went off to sleep in various guest rooms in that palace. And finally only Paris was left, standing alone, looking into those flames. And as he stood there, suddenly he heard a sound far off in the depths of the palace. Psh! And then he heard laughter. Yes, it was definitely laughter, ringing out, echoing through the hallways of the palace. "What is that?" he thought. He stood there, the fire crackled. And then a little while later it came again. Ksh! Bah! Laughter ringing out through the hallways of the palace. Well, Paris turned from that fire, and he walked out of that yellow room. And he walked down the hallways of the palace, following the sound of that laughter. And after a while this sound led him to the very feasting hall of that palace itself. And there was a fire burning in the hearth in the center of the room, the smoke going up through a hole in the ceiling. And there were two women there by the fire. And one of them, he could see in that moment, was backlit by the flames. And she had a wine bottle in her left hand and a wine glass in her right hand, and she was holding it up. And the other woman said, "But it's Egyptian glass, my sister." "Ah, but it sounds so beautiful when it shatters," said the other, and she threw the glass into the fire. Shh! And her laughter rang out up to the roof beams of the palace. "You are a wild one," said the other. "Well then," said the woman with the wine bottle in her hand, "let me be wild. Someone has to be wild in this world, so why not me, Helen, the daughter of Zeus?" And she laughed again, and her beautiful laugh seemed to claim every stone and wooden beam in that palace. And then, in this moment, Paris, not knowing why or how, he took a step forward and then another, instinctively, as if he could do nothing else. And hearing his footsteps, they both turned and saw him there. And Paris said, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude. It seems there's been a great feast here, but that now it's over." And Helen looked at him and saw his beauty and saw the fire in the center of the room burning, reflected in his eyes. And she said, "No, it's just beginning." Well, the next morning, Paris awoke in a good, soft bed in that palace. He was alone, and Helios, the sun god, was casting his rays through the open windows onto the floor. And that day he shared a meal in that same feasting hall with Helen and her husband Menelaus. And Paris's friend Aeneas was there, and all the sailors. And they ate the good food that was before them, and they told their story, how they had set out for Crete, but how a storm had blown them wildly off course and brought them there, to the kingdom of Sparta. "Well, the gods have brought you to us," said Menelaus, "and we are grateful for that. We will entertain you here and welcome you until you are ready to go on with your journey." "Thank you," said Paris. So for 9 days they rested in that palace in the kingdom of Sparta. And Menelaus often took Paris walking around that palace. And he showed him all their orchards, and he showed them the fine Spartan horses they had in the stables, and they walked down by the sea, and he showed them their wonderful garden at the center of this palace. So the days passed, but each day there would also be a feast, and often, when Menelaus was distracted, Paris would reach down and pick up Helen's wine glass, and looking deep into her eyes, he would run his lips around the edge of that wine glass. And she would smile, and that smile was almost as beautiful as the cackle of her laughter he'd heard some nights before. And sometimes their feet would brush against each other beneath the table, and then rest atop one another, each enjoying the warmth of the other. And then one day a messenger came, all the way from Crete to the palace of Sparta. And he came into the throne room, and he spoke to Menelaus and to Helen. And he brought the news that Menelaus' grandfather Catreus had died. So it was decided that Menelaus would journey at once to Crete for the funeral. So, on a bright morning, all was prepared, and a ship was loaded down with supplies. And Menelaus and Helen, his queen, walked from the palace through the forest, and past the stone watchtower and across the beach to the boat. And Menelaus turned and looked at Helen. "Goodbye, my queen," he said. "Goodbye." "Goodbye, my husband," said Helen, and she kissed him on the cheek. And he turned and he got into that boat, and the sailors pushed off from the shore, and that boat began to sail away. And Helen stood there, the wind tussling her long hair, looking out as the boat sailed away. Further and further it went over the waves. And then she couldn't bear it any longer, and she turned away. And then she strode up the beach, past the stone watchtower, through the forest, and through the gate of her palace. And she walked down the hallways, and she walked to the feasting hall, but Paris was not there. And she walked to the eastern room, where Paris and his sailors had dried themselves out that first night, but Paris was not there. And she walked to the kitchen, and she walked into the guest rooms, but nowhere could she find him. And at last she walked out into the garden of the palace, and there, in the center of the garden, beneath a blossoming pear tree, in the light, stood Paris. And the white blossoms came dizzy down from the heights of that tree to the ground. And Helen walked towards Paris, but in her heart she ran, faster and faster, across the garden. What would she say? What could she say? It didn't matter. She could say anything. In that moment she came to him. They looked at each other. "Let's go," she said. It was a golden candlestick first. A serving woman noticed it. It was not where it should be. Normally it was there, on the table, on the right side of the door in the feasting hall, but now it was simply gone. And in fact, as she looked around, the 3 silver candlesticks were missing as well, from the table on the other side of the door. "Is someone stealing?" she thought to herself. And she walked out of the feasting hall and to the yellow room. And in that room, the tapestry on the wall that depicted the fight of the gods with the giants at the beginning of time, it was not there. It was simply gone. And other servants began to notice that things were missing. Things were not where they should be in that palace. Someone was stealing, it seemed. And then Helen strode into the feasting hall, and she approached a maid there, and she said, "Where is that silver Sidonian bowl?" And the maid said, "I think it's in the garden. A maid is cleaning it." And Helen walked through the feasting hall and through the kitchen and out to the garden. And there, sitting by the door, was a maid, and she was polishing the silver Sidonian bowl. "That bowl is clean enough," said Helen, "for I have need of it." And she reached down and she took the silver bowl out of the maid's hands, a beautiful bowl, sparkling in the light of the sun. And all around the outside of this bowl was the image of a boy attempting to drive the chariot of the sun. And the horses were going wildly in all directions, and the stars were jiggling with fear in the sky, and it seemed the earth itself would be scorched by the light of that sun. And the terror, the confusion, and the joy in that boy's eyes and in that scene rang out from that bowl as the sun shone upon it, its reflected light spangling the leaves of the garden. And Helen took that bowl, and she walked back through the palace, through the kitchen, through the feasting hall, down the long hallway, and out the front gate of the palace, and there was a wagon, and she placed that silver bowl into that wagon, beside the golden candlestick, and the 3 silver candlesticks, and the tapestry depicting the combat of the gods and the giants. And there were 2 horses there at the head of that wagon, and Paris was beside them. And Helen said, "Come, my love, I need your help." And Paris followed her into the palace. and they walked down its hallways to a storeroom way in the back of that palace. And they opened the door, and they went inside, and there was a wooden chest on the floor filled with gold pieces. And Paris said, "My dear, the royal treasury?" "Yes, my love," said Helen, "for we are going on a long journey, and who knows where we will end up." And with her hand she brought his head close to hers, and their lips met sweetly in the shadows of that storeroom. And then they bent down and lifted that wooden chest up, and carried it out of that storeroom and down the hallway and out the front gate and put it in the wagon. Now by this time the servants were wandering around, confused, uncertain what was happening, what was going on. But if they were in confusion, Helen was not. She came close to one of them, a servant who she trusted most, and she said, "Aethra, my dear, I am going on a trip. Will you come with me? Will you leave all this behind? Will you come seek a newer world?" And Aethra, her servant, looked at Helen and said, "I will, my queen." "Then gather the others," said Helen, "for our journey awaits." And soon Aethra gathered many servants loyal to Helen, and they all got in the wagon. And Paris spurred the horses on, and they rode away from that palace and through the forest, and past the stone watchtower and across the beach to the boat. And they all got out, and they loaded the silver candlesticks and the gold candlesticks into the boat, and they carried that chest full of gold pieces, and the tapestry depicting the battle of the gods with the giants, and many other things besides, into the hold of this boat. And then they all got on board, and Paris held Helen's hand as she stepped into the boat, and then Paris himself followed. And the sailors pushed off from the shore, and that boat set sail. And back at the palace, on a high balcony, two serving women were standing, looking out, watching that ship sailing away. And one of them said to the other, "There goes our queen." And the other said, "She was never ours. She does not belong even to Zeus. She is her own woman. And I think soon this Trojan prince will learn this as well." Well then, hello. Thank you for listening to this story. Thank you for giving your attention to it on this day, at this time, whatever that is. What a story, huh? It's just lovely. It's amazing. I'm amazed by this story. Beautiful moments. And I invite you to replay this story in your imagination. I invite you to return to it now or some other time, to think back over it, like a song you've heard, like a map also, could be, like a landscape. Find a place in this story which snaps for you, which jumps out, which jolts you in any way, which catches you. That's it, what catches you. And attend to that moment. That's a more certain way into this story than anything I could say. So I invite you to do that right now, to think of the images in this story, to find one. And if something comes up, wonderful. If nothing does, that's all right too. Maybe it'll come to you on another day. All of a sudden, you'll think of something in this story. For me, the goddess going down into the dark, the mother, the woman with her child descending into darkness, that sticks out for me. And Helen smashing the glasses, of course. But let's stick with the first one. Thetis, the goddess, to make her son invulnerable, to free him from death, she must enter death in a bodily way, physically going down into the underworld and going to the very bottom itself, to the river Styx, a river which is poisonous. It's poisonous to humans, surely, and it's also not so pleasant for gods. It doesn't kill the gods, is my understanding, but it's not pleasant. So she must go there and dip him in this, must submerge him in that. It's a wild wisdom at the heart of this story. To protect yourself against this hostile force, you must enter that hostile force with intention. Maybe that's what's important. You must enter it on purpose, because before it comes to you accidentally. Does that fit our lives? Does that apply? Is it a homeopathic type thing? Is it something where if you want to encounter, if you want to deal with your fear, you must first consciously, with intention, confront that fear so that it doesn't just jump on you unawares? Maybe that's what's going on. But she doesn't want to get in this water. She wants to keep her hands out of it because it doesn't feel so good for the gods, we would assume. So she holds him by the ankle and dunks him down in the river but the ankle doesn't get dunked. It doesn't get in the water. And that is quite a moment as well. We should all do that. I mean, I don't know. We shouldn't put our kids in the water, but just stand there for a moment. Imagine yourself doing that. Mime it, act it out. That feeling of dunking a child, slipping a child into the water. She could have held him in both hands and got him under the water that way, but she didn't want to get her hands in the water, so she just held onto his ankle and down he went. She preserved herself. That's what parents do. I mean, I'm a parent of a wonderful daughter, and so I guess I know, or I've had to learn something of that. You know, you protect your child, but you protect yourself as well, because if you go down, there's no one to care for the child. So she's protecting herself in the act of protecting Achilles in the river. It's just a wild scene. And Homer doesn't include this scene. As you can tell, we haven't even gotten to the main Homeric story, the epic of the Iliad. This is all pre that. This is all before that happens. But I wanted to include everything. Well, not everything. I want to include like all the background to these characters because I found it was so wonderful. So many cool scenes. And this particular scene is, well, I have to say as a storyteller, a little problematic. Because to have one of the heroes of the story be in a war and be invulnerable is kind of a problem. Because suddenly nothing is at risk, nothing is at stake. If he can just be a god and the swords and the spears just bounce off him, well, what's the fun in that? What is the risk in that? Then it becomes meaningless. And Homer, in his epic, the Iliad, makes no mention of this scene. And Achilles is definitely not invulnerable in Homer's Iliad. There's a scene where he is wounded and he bleeds. So this scene, I didn't really want to include it because I don't want Achilles to be just, invulnerable the whole time. But it's such a compelling scene. It's such a primally beautiful scene. I wanted to include it. So I just mashed it up with the scene of her putting him in the fire to make him immortal. That's the deal, if you didn't get it. Like the river keeps him invulnerable. The fire makes him immortal. And we've seen this before. We've seen this in the story of Demeter and Persephone, where Demeter, wandering the earth in grief for her daughter Persephone, who has been taken away by Hades, the god of the underworld, She stays in a village, and there she cares for a human boy, and she attempts to make him immortal. And she does it in exactly the same way, by putting him in a fire. And it is interrupted in exactly the same way, by a human, curious in the night, opening the door and interrupting the spell, interrupting the ceremony. So that's very interesting. These stories, especially a story like this, the Iliad, which is such, it's well-traveled ground, but it's also just deep soil. There are many connections in these stories. And as a performer of the Iliad, I have to say, you're spoiled for choice. There's so many options on all of these incidents of the story. It's the best I can do just to get a coherent narrative going without including every possible variation on these stories, And we could look to the Mahabharata, the Epic of India. And why would we do that, you may ask? Well, it's a parallel story. At the beginning of that epic, there is a character named Bhishma, and it describes his birth, because there's a human king, and he falls in love with Gunga, the goddess of the river Ganges. And she does not change her shape like Thetis does, but she makes the same pronouncement. She has the same condition. She says, I will only be with you if you agree not to question any of my actions. He agrees to this, and they have children. They have 7 children, one after the other, each year, and Gunga drowns each one in the river to send them back to the world of the gods. The hero, Bhishma, is the 8th son of this king, whose name is Shantanu. So in the Iliad, it's pretty much exactly the same situation. And in fact, many variations of this story, many versions of it, describe how Thetis and Peleus had 7 sons. And all of them were given to the fire, and the ceremony went through to its end, and they were whisked away, we might imagine, to the world of the gods and made immortal. But Achilles is the 8th son, and that was interrupted, etc., just like I've told it here. And what does Muddy Waters say in his blues song? I'm the 7th son. I'm the one, I'm the 7th son. There's an old understanding here that the 7th son, or perhaps the one after, there's a slight numerological problem here, it's true, the 8th son, maybe, is magical, that those numbers have something of meaning to them. Well, is there an answer to that question? It's not really a question. You just want to bring these stories together, want to bring that blues song together with these, and feel how these things hum when we bring them together. Feel how each one, sort of like a magnet, has an effect on the other and charges them, and they all sort of glow. And you can feel that resonance, as when you ring a bell and the guitar you are holding also hums and vibrates. So we've got the Mahabharata, we've got the Iliad, and many other stories besides. So I'm just telling you a little bit behind the scenes here, what I've done with this story. I've taken out those 7 other sons because that was a lot to explain. and I have decided to include the scene with the river Styx and just to combine it with the episode of the fire there. And Thetis, of course, when she establishes this condition that King Peleus cannot question any of her actions, she's asking to be treated as a goddess and not as a human. Because with humans, we question each other's actions, You made a peanut butter and jelly sandwich when you could have had that piece of pizza. Why did you do that? And we would question actions that humans do. But gods and goddesses are like natural forces. It's like questioning the wind or a hurricane. Why did you blow down that house? Why did you destroy that city? Well, in hurricanes and fires, we can ask those questions, but they're sort of beyond such questions. And she, by establishing that condition, wishes to tell him, look, I'm a goddess. I'm not going to be boxed in by your questions. But nevertheless, she is in relationship with a human, in a human palace, in a human kingdom. And so inevitably, there is this conflict, and he questions her, and off she goes. And do we want Achilles to be invulnerable? Do we want him to be immortal, a god? Where's the fun in that? Well, as far as the story goes, we want some risk. We want some danger. And so in the practical decisions that anyone telling the story must make, you find yourself negotiating between the divine and the human realms and figuring out the difference between them and feeling the difference between them. Here we are on this broken place, in this broken place where humans suffer and die. And that's where we live. But we know of this other realm. We dream of the eternal realm. We aspire to that, perhaps. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Leonard Cohen. So we're here in this cracked world. And perhaps it's through that brokenness. Perhaps it's because Peleus interrupts the ceremony that something truly magical happens, which the goddess could not have imagined, which Peleus could not have imagined. And then we get Patroclus. And I should let you know there is a backstory to Patroclus, which I did not include. And it is this. He is a little older than Achilles, and he is in the kingdom of Pythia there with Achilles. He's been sent there. He's in exile because not long before he was playing dice with another boy, and he got angry. He pushed the boy. The boy hit himself against a rock, and he died. And so his father, Patroclus' father, exiled him from the kingdom and sent him to live with King Peleus and Thetis and with Achilles. So, yeah, I didn't include that, but it's pretty interesting because we shall see as we go deeper into this story. Achilles, it's the wrath of Achilles, right? That's the main theme of Homer's epic, the Iliad. And we shall see Achilles gives in to anger and rage. And because of that, he is so angry at Agamemnon that he chooses not to fight in the war. And because of that, many of his fellow soldiers die because he's not there to help them and to fight the Trojans. So there is a great cost to Achilles' anger. Patroclus has already seen the cost of anger. He's already seen the consequences of letting your anger loose in the world in this way. So he is, in some sense, wiser than Achilles, at least in that realm. He is usually described as gentler and capable of restraint, which Achilles is not. So that's the backstory there. That's why he has come to this kingdom. I don't know. It's pretty important. Maybe I should include it next time around. But, I'm just letting you know. And as far as their relationship goes, just to talk about that right away, it's basically a gay relationship as far as we can tell. Homer doesn't really state that, but it's sort of like Homer exists in a world where it's not necessary to state that. That's how it seems to me. I don't feel like Homer is hiding anything. It's just he doesn't have these big labels to put on things. And as you can imagine, it's kind of a weird business to declare someone's sexual preference, is he going to show public displays of affection between them? He doesn't show that, I guess, in the epic. So you might argue they're just good friends. But I think anyone who reads that story, Homer's story, closely, spoiler alert, but Achilles has a golden urn, and his wish is that when he dies and Patroclus dies, he wants their ashes to be both put in that urn and buried together. That's pretty intense, And they're often seen together, They live together. They're in the same tent in the battle. So anyway, yeah. So that's the deal with Homer. From our modern perspective, we might think Homer doesn't go far enough because he doesn't use words we're accustomed to, like, oh, they were gay or whatever. But I think it's pretty clear that's the relationship going on. There is a play by Aeschylus, which has been lost. So, there was a play. Most of his work, Aeschylus, the Greek playwright, has been destroyed over time and lost by fallen prey to the elements, we might say. But he had a play in which they were out and out gay lovers, apparently. And I would love to know what that play was like. But we don't have it, of course. So it's popular now to quote unquote reinterpret these old stories and to give them a quote modern spin and to challenge their assumptions. That's the way we talk. But I think we get a little too excited about this, because if you look at the tradition, it's not a monolithic tradition, to use that word. It's not a story that's like, oh, it's just this one way, and anything else is heresy, is wrong. It's not like the Catholic Church, where there's one truth which is decided upon, and then everything else gets you excommunicated. It's not quite like that. The Odyssey, the Iliad, these stories have been told for thousands of years in many different ways. And it's true, Homer's epic is so compelling and so beautiful that it has acquired a great force, and that becomes the one story we know about this war. But when you look at it, well, Homer doesn't include the Trojan horse. That isn't mentioned in it. Well, it might be mentioned. I have to think about that. But it's not described in that story. And neither is the episode where the river Styx described. All kinds of things on the sides of it aren't described. So where am I going with this? I guess what I'm saying is that reinterpreting this story, seeing it in a new way, is a long-standing tradition. And it's not just that now we've suddenly woken up and we're like, oh, there could be another way. There have always been other ways. Certainly many of the alternate versions of this story have been lost. There's no question about that. And I wonder what they were like. I wonder what versions were told. I wonder what versions women told. That's an interesting question. Were there female storytellers who told this epic? I mean, if you look at the history of storytelling, men and women both tell stories. It's not a male, craft. It's one shared by women and men. Generally, they're in different realms. Generally, the men are in the court with the king, getting paid money, and the women, the female storytellers, are telling stories amongst themselves or in different environments, among women or to the children. So anyway, you see that with the Grimm's fairy tales. It was a very odd thing, in a way, for the Grimm brothers to approach female storytellers and ask to be told the stories. And in some cases, certain women were like, whoa, this story, you can't handle it, guys. I can't tell it to you. So they used other informants. They got if I remember, I can't remember the woman's name, but there was a young woman they got to go to this particular storyteller to hear a particularly gory and bloody version of one fairy tale, which she felt that the men could not handle. And she told it to this young woman, who then told it to the Grimms. Yeah. So I'm just kind of piling on the stuff here, things to say. I got lots to say. Sorry, you can rewind if I'm talking too fast. I'll try to slow down. The Mahabharata, the Indian epic, has been preserved in a Brahmanic way. So the Brahmins, the spiritual guides of that civilization, of that culture, they have preserved one version of the story. And in the villages, there are many other versions, often told by women. So you can find both versions now, and it's interesting to see the differences between them. Anyway, so there's certain incidents which there's an official kind of version and then a kind of many other versions. So all of this, again, is just to say that this story is more like a river than it is like a solid stone, And these days, the corporations of the world, Disney, places like that, they take stories and they make a single version out of them, which is then replicated, all over the world in a movie or in a book, perhaps, more often a movie. And everyone sees it and they're like, that's it. Cinderella, that's how Cinderella goes. There's no other way. But in fact, there is another way. There are millions of other ways. You can find your own way into that story. You can tell it a different way. So with the Iliad, that's what we're dealing with, is a story which has been wrestled with, has been danced with for thousands of years. And there are many versions of these stories. And when we think we're challenging it now, well, I don't know. We're just part of the tradition. It's always been part of the tradition to challenge narratives and make them your own and alter them slightly. And we see this with the portrayal of Helen as well. Like, it just doesn't end, this kind of thing, right? There's endless versions, I'm telling you. And so I've told a version where she initiates the elopement, if that's the right word, right? She initiates this running off with Paris. She sees him and she's like, oh yeah, all right, let's go. That's a version I like, so that's the one I picked. Another version is one where Paris seizes hold of her. It's the rape of Helen, some call it. It has been called. So she is stolen away, probably sexually violated, and is his prisoner, basically. That's another version. I didn't like that one, so I chose not to tell it. I chose this other version. And it doesn't stop there. There's a version by a poet and a bard with the fabulous name Stesichorus. Wow, Stesichorus. Sounds like a guitar pedal I would use in my band. Stesichorus. So he was a 6th century BC poet and bard. He had another version of the story entirely, where the real Helen is whisked away to Egypt for the duration of the war. And the Helen that goes to Troy is, in fact, a sort of a phantom Helen, an evil twin, as we might say. And that's the one that the Greeks and the Trojans fight over. And then when the war ends, Menelaus, her former husband, leaves the war. A storm blows him to Egypt, and they reunite in a cave, I believe, in Egypt. And she says, oh, by the way, I'm the real Helen. That was just an evil twin the whole time. So that's interesting, huh? I chose not to tell that one because I think it's kind of silly, honestly. But, well, so it is. Sometimes it's silly. So I chose the version I did. And in the version I chose, well, we have what? We have forbidden love, huh? We have love which breaks down the social order. Love which challenges things as they are, the stability of life, and brings havoc to this world of orderly, calm marriage where nobody goes outside the bounds. And that's a compelling story. And so I chose it, and that's the one that we have here. So I invite you to recall this story yourself and to sit with its images. With the wine glass tossed into the fire, shattering there. With the wooden chest filled with gold pieces, lifted out of the storeroom and placed in the wagon. With the silver Sidonian bowl, which will show up in the Odyssey, oddly enough. Decorated with the image of the boy attempting to drive the chariot of the sun god. I invite you to go wherever you wish to in this story, and to places I have not even described, to go stand on that shore, watching the boat go away, to go into the kitchen, see what's in the drawers, to go up to the high towers of that palace and to look out at the world, and to look possibly across at the kingdom of Pythia and that meadow where there was once a wedding between a human and a goddess, where once the humans and the gods laughed and danced together and sang, their music going up into the bright air. I invite you to stand there in that meadow and hear that music, and to hear its absence, to hear the silence after that music has stopped.